Welcome everyone to today's QA stream. There's another week of the jam passed. I'm sure you guys have a lot of questions. We're here to answer them. Today with me is both Daniel and Eric.
Hey,
Yeah.
hey guys, Eric here. Thanks for having us, Luke.
Yeah. Hello, everyone. I'm Daniel, and thanks, Luke and Eric for having me as well.
And we're really here to answer all your questions. So please just write them into the stream chat and we will get onto it. You can ask anything about Photon in general or the game jam or multiplayer. We're here to give you advice, help you out. I think while we're waiting, I might have a question for you actually, Daniel.
Yeah, sure.
With quantum, we have actually 3 physics modes, right? So we have a 2D, a 3D, and a 2.5D mode.
Yeah.
Could you explain to people a bit what this is about and why this is different from what Unity has?
Yeah, sure. Yeah, so I did not properly introduce myself. So I'm the lead physics developer of the Quantum SDK, although I also work on the Fusion SDK, mainly on the lag compensation and transform behavior. So yeah, talking about quantum physics, right? So there are two different game engines, a 2D engine and a 3D one. And it's similar to, in a way, similar to Unity's split between 2D physics and 3D physics as well. The main difference is that for the quantum's 2D physics, there's also half extra dimension, if you can call it this way, which is depth. So it works like a 2D engine in most ways, except you cannot have if you compare to a 3D engine, you cannot have arbitrary rotations. So the rotations of the objects are still in the vertical axis, but you can have depth on the colliders, and this can help you implement some features that most people would do in 3D, even though they do not necessarily need a fully 3D physics. And naturally, the 2D physics is much cheaper than the 3D. So we often try to suggest when in this more simple concepts where you can have just it implemented in 2.5D just with depth and have a much lighter simulation instead of you have the same features in 3D without using the full power of a 3D physics, right? So that's the main idea.
Yeah, that's a good point. Like there are a lot of games which the gameplay is really just on the 2D plane, right? And you don't need the full 3D, but sometimes you need a little bit.
Yes.
Now I saw we also had a question in the chat now.
Yeah, I was answering directly to him or her directly in the chat, but I will take that one if you don't mind, Luke, because it's a question about Pun 2. Like the question is if it's possible to use half precision floats, and I mean it is, but it's a manual process that you have to serialize. In Pun, you would do this on unserialized view, but the reason I want to ask this to answer this in the stream is for two reasons. So first, me and Daniel, we do not directly work with Pun, although I understand Pun well as well. We're part of the quantum and fusion core teams, and I would just take this opportunity to say I even asked on the chat what was the reason to ask about halves, and of course my guess was correct. It was about bandwidth. And the point is, as we've been saying many times, etc., Fusion handles bandwidth so much better. You have interest management, both in running client server mode or even running in shared mode, which is similar to Pun. You have area of interest. It also sends data only on change. And that makes the whole thing much more efficient bandwidth wise. You normally don't even have to bother about this kind of, oh, I should reduce the precision. And same way, quantum, because it's deterministic and only sends input, bandwidth is fixed, so you don't even have to bother about bandwidth. And in the end, you choose between the two based on the gameplay you're building, not even about network considerations. In the end, it's about gameplay, and that's how it should be. That's how you should choose netcode. So yet it is the answer. It is possible to do with pun with hefs, but you had to do manually. It's a lot more complex. Yeah, Daniel. Daniel asked me something internally here. Go ahead.
Yeah,
Talk about
so
hefs. Yeah.
I've been working this week on a half floating point implementation for Fusion, coincidentally, and it's almost ready. You're just doing tests. So if you're looking for a way to have the data in an even more compressed way, for working, you're all working on with smaller numbers that can be in a smaller range of numbers. Let's say that can be represented just fine with half float precision, then yeah, this will be available soon for Fusion.
And notice that the full precision actually is quantized. So it works even better than half precision in terms
Yeah,
of bandwidth. So it's
correct.
kind of really not necessary to do, but yeah, you are working on it will be even more efficient, but we're talking really about putting hundreds of people in the same room, right? So it's
Exactly.
really
Yeah.
on the very high. I'm just checking here for his question about gameplay, synchronization, and state.
I think the other point they made is that they want to use pun because it is easier to use than fusion.
I don't think
So
it is,
I
but
think,
yeah,
yeah, Eric, like maybe we can tell people a bit about that. I think a lot of people have that fear coming from pun and now
a lot of
going to
people think
fusion.
pun is easier. Pun may be easier if you already know pun. And of course, there are some tutorials about pun around, and tutorials about fusion are just popping up. But honestly, fusion is easier. For example, what he's trying to do to use halves ends up that you have to write your own serialization of reading and writing the objects. In fusion, it doesn't matter. You always, yeah, if you're talking about hundreds of units, I don't think it's going to work in pun like that. You should really consider going for quantum. It's really, that's why we design more modern and more better tailored tools. It's to handle these complex use cases. Running hundreds of units, it goes into RTS, real-time strategy territory. Every single RTS you've probably played uses determinism, which is what quantum implements. So you will not scale to do this with pun. That's my short answer to that. And yeah, but comparing pun to fusion, any data you want to synchronize, you just mark networked with an attribute, and that's it. It's if you modify, it is synchronized. Or from the if it modified from the machine that owns that object in shared mode is one of the clients, it will be transferred to the others who have to see it. So I think we have more questions, Luke.
Yes, we had a question about how to use nav mesh with fusion in multi-peer mode specifically. Would any of you guys like to take that one?
That's a very specific question on nav mesh surfaces, right? So nav mesh surfaces, which is the extension of the basic nav mesh tooling on Unity, and he's specifically asking about multi-peer mode and specifically runner visibility nodes, right? So runner visibility nodes is a development tool to help Fusion enable disable some elements of one of the peers when you only want to see from one of the others. My first recommendation here is that if you're using nav mesh in general in client server mode in Fusion, you should only have the nav mesh on the server. and not even have it on the clients. If you're trying to synchronize the target position and actually move the objects on the different clients, this is not really a good approach in state transfer. This is how you do in Quantum, not in Fusion, because well, that's how it is designed. So, but because you're using multi-peer mode, I assume it's client server. I would only have the nav mesh at all on the server and never even have it on the client scene, only on the server one.
Yes, I
We're
think
not
that's good
copying the
advice.
surface data. I mean, when you say it's copying the surface data, we don't network nav mesh data, so I don't understand exactly what that means.
I think one point where you can trick over here is that if you load scenes additively with Unity, Unity still considers all of them like one physical scene. And for physics, we have a way to deal with that with individual physics scenes. But
Yeah.
this does not apply to every Unity system and it does not apply to NavMesh. So all your surfaces will be combined into a single one. There
If
are
it's
ways
combining
to
in real
work
time,
around
right?
that.
Is it being baked in real time? Look here, because
I was
if
assuming
you,
they have an FMesh surface just in the scene, and
yeah,
then
then
it
it will
would.
be loaded on the multiple scenes, and node visibility would not. Yeah, I would not have it. I would have a separate scene just with the nav mesh, and I would load it only on the server and not on the clients.
Yeah,
But I don't. I'm not sure even multi-peer mode. I don't think Unity treats nav mesh as instance. That's what you said, right, Luke?
yeah. There's only a
Okay.
single
s-
nav mesh in
Yeah.
total.
So
Like
let
you
me go
cannot
back.
have them per
So the
scene.
problem here is Unity, that Unity does not have a solution for nav meshes to be instances. It's like a static, or maybe nav mesh surfaces for that, right, Luke? But
No,
it's a
it
bit
still doesn't do that,
yeah.
unfortunately.
Unity.
There is a trick to this, which is layers. So you
Oh, so
can
it's
use one layer per scene, and these will be like roughly completely separated from each
but
other.
it's a
But it's
workaround. It's actually a single nav
exactly.
mesh with layers. So yeah, the problem is that Unity does not support nav mesh instances. It's just a single nav mesh for the engine itself. So yeah, for that reason is limited. And now I got what you said, because physics, I mean, it was not originally, but Unity eventually created a way for you to step physics yourself using different scenes, and you would isolate them into different physics instances. And because that exists, we can make use of that to actually implement multi-peer in physics. And but in navmesh it's not really possible. Daniel, should I or you take the question about quantum VR?
I can take it, and you add your comments if you will. So yeah, this specific link, the specific demo you were mentioning, it's as you mentioned, this from Quantum One. It's quite old, so that's why it's no longer accessible. But there isn't nothing. There's a few things in particular for VR in the context of quantum, especially for inputs and to make the view feel accurate. To snap the view to the local input of the player, regardless of the simulation state, to make sure the player feels um, responsiveness from the system, right? That's one point. And another concern is regarding inputs, but for quantum, for the next version of quantum, we are going to support input delta compression. So this will work very well for VR samples where you can have like larger strokes to send the hands and head positions and information in a more streamlined way. But even on Quantum 2 as it is, there are ways to encode this information in a concise way to avoid having large input strokes. And so we can share this. We can share snippets with you in the public channel. So please, Irina, if you can have this make this question again in one of the forums, and we can try and share some of the snippets we have to compress this data. Eric?
I'm trying. I'm just gonna kick someone here. How can I do this?
I've kicked them from YouTube. I think the
Yeah, okay,
messages
thank you.
stay here in Restream.
No, we can delete the messages as well.
So
Okay.
yeah, sorry for interrupting you, Daniel. Anything
Yeah, no
else I
problem.
Um,
can?
I had
Yeah.
finished my idea. I think Eric
yeah,
would like to.
I
Yeah.
have my points about fusion and quantum in VR. The point is that fusion is has been much easier for the VR community to grasp, and we've been focusing on writing samples for fusion instead.
Yeah.
Most of the use cases for VR can arguably be better handled by fusion, so we do not recommend quantum for VR unless it's a very specific case. This question has been asked on another stream. I already answered, but I'm going to do it again. So unless you are doing something very specific that requires a physics sandbox kind of simulation, you throwing things at each other, I would not do it with quantum. I would just do it with fusion. Um, and even if you are doing physics things, remember that quantum is great because physics is always synchronized, but it has limitations. It's not for everything. So, uh, super stable stacking is not its most impressive thing feature. And also, if you have things that are very small in scale, like you're manipulating things with your hands, then quantum is not also the best answer for that. So the answer it depends, and because most use cases are better handled by fusion, we're basically moving all samples to be fusion instead. About the question from no artists available, I mean, yes, Pun was a great product. It is easy for you to use, but it has a lot of limitations. It had a lot of you could only put a few people, you could only put a few objects because it has limitations in the way it works. That's why we design better things. And honestly, fusion in shared mode is not more complex than Pun. You just mark data as networked, and you do not have to use simulation behaviors, although simulation behavior is essentially the same as a photon view mono behavior, a photon behavior that you inherit from. It's just that it is the fusion version of that. It's a parallel to what the other one does. It invites you to write simulation code from our update, not for Unity's updates, because that gives you tick accuracy when running client server mode. But especially when running shared mode, you don't have to. You can just use the Unity regular update to modify your own object, and it will work. It will be synchronized. So you don't have to use all that. And that's what all the samples are for. It's to give you an initial starting point. But honestly, Fusion in shared mode is essentially the same approach as Pun. You have it's simpler because you only add networked variables. You don't have to write code for on serialize like you have in Pun. So it's less code. And the rest is the same. You spawn an object locally on your client, it will be synchronized to others. And you have RPCs the same way you have in Pun, but they're much faster all of a sudden because of the different way it's handled internally. But um if it's still have been a bit difficult, we apologize, but it's about documentation and new tutorials coming out that to help with that. It's what we can do. The only thing we can point to right now is check the new 100 series tutorial, the revised version of it, and the samples we have right now. Yeah, on serialized view honestly is boilerplate code. Is the stuff you do not have to write in Fusion because it's automatically done for you. You just mark a property and networked, it's already networked. On serialized view is honestly boilerplate code that you didn't have to write in the first place. So you do not have to deal with that. You go to deal with your gameplay instead, which is arguably much more important. If you look into quantum, it's even one step further. You do not even have anything networked. You just think about gameplay. It forces you to just write your game and forget about the things that you should not bother with. That's our honest opinion. So let's see.
Regarding VR hand tracking, I guess as Eric said, if it's nothing that is too physics related, then maybe Fusion would be an easier road for you if you just want to implement VR hand tracking, I would say.
There's a good one for you, Daniel. I know the answer to that one, but I will let you answer this. Splines.
Oh yeah, spline. So there is a nice way to. So we have some math implementations for splines on our fixed point math library, like Hermit and I
Catmull.
forgot the others.
Hermit and Catmull.
Catmull, yeah. And if you have like a predefined spline, then you can just use quantum assets. It's immutable data. You have the FP animation curve struct that you can like define a specific curve that you can predefine if some it does not look like something you want
Yeah.
to that applies to your use case, but is it's one way of sending curve data to quantum. But
Uh,
for this
uh,
specific case or follow the rabbit, I would use one
yeah.
of the two
Implementations we
math
have. Yeah.
implementations in the
So,
FT math
so
library.
a follow the rabbit thing is essentially you have waypoints,
Yeah.
and you are currently at between a few of these waypoints. So essentially, you combine an asset that defines all the waypoints for you as a
Hmm.
collection, as a ring buffer, like an array, and then you use one of the spline implementations we have internally, either Catmull
Yeah.
or Hermite, to interpolate at the place you are. So you have to track in a component in which point, in which index you are in between, and then you use one of the and plus the alpha in between them. Those two pieces of data you have to track in a component that's mutable, but then you use the Catmull or Hermite implementations we have internally to actually get the position on the spline, um, based on the parameters that you define for them, and you can define these parameters per point and so on. But yeah, that's the best way to do it.
Yeah.
It's combine
Definitely.
assets for the waypoints with the implementations we have for the curve math for a few the two implementations we have.
Hmm.
That's the best way. We do not have an asset. Oh, here's an spline with a no.
If you
Although it
want,
would be something interesting
yes,
to for somebody to do and
yeah.
expose.
If it's, I wanted to mention about FP animation curves as another way of sending curve data into the simulation, but does not really
Apply
apply
to
to
this
this
example,
use
no, yeah.
case. Yeah.
Um, Ludo, do you want to take this one, Luke? You know the answer for this.
I think so. So the next question from Ludo is how to check when a network object has been initialized. So when can you access the networked properties? When is that safe to do? And here, essentially, you should not use the built-in Unity callbacks, so start, awake, update, but you should use our callbacks instead. There is an override on spawned, and this gets called when the object is ready to be used and spawned, and all the data from the network properties is available. So you can use that, and then you can also always access them in networked fixed update, right? A fixed update
Yeah,
network, then they're also ready.
the best answer is to move your logic to where the logic belongs. So to access data for initialization, use spawned instead of start. It's the best. But if you want to do something from Unity updates, you can always check is valid if the object is null, like you suggested yourself, or that also works. But the best is to that's why we suggest our it's like, I mean, there are some things on Unity that people do because it's easy, but it's not necessarily the best. So ideally, for example, if you want to do a very, very accurate game, you should always write all your logic on Unity's fixed update, not on Unity's update. But then you also have to interpolate your views and decouple two game objects, one for the view, and nobody does that honestly in single player games on Unity for whatever traditional reason that how people wrote tutorials. But that is the way people build, for example, AAA games. View is decoupled from simulation. Um, it's in a certain way we try to encourage you to use the best approaches, and using the right callbacks is the best answer here.
And for scene objects, the same really applies. As long as you're
Yeah.
using the default scene manager with Fusion, all scene objects will get automatically spawned when you start the runner with the scene.
If you use the original scene manager, they're going to be automatically injected into Quantum. But when the scene is loaded, it doesn't even mean that Fusion has loaded already, right? So you may load a scene that has these objects, but Fusion is not running yet. So the only reliable way for you to know that an object has been initialized is when they get spawned. So spawned is going to be called. Fixed update network is going to be called. So you could from the Unity update keep checking if object is null or if is valid is another one that we have, or if the runner is already injected into that object. You could check that, but that's less efficient because you would have to have that if every update. So yeah.
We have another great question, which is what's the difference between network bool and regular bools? Do you want to take that one, Eric?
Network bool is our internal implementation of a memory aligned boolean that we can send over the network, so you can use that one. And when you mark a property as network regular bool, we basically internally store ours. Both work for you. You could actually use either. And that ends up being the same with if you use network string with the generic attribute for the max size of it, or if you use just a regular string and you mark it as networked with a max capacity. In the end, these are two syntax. This is syntax sugar for two ways of doing the same thing.
Does this also apply to iNetwork struct? So can people also just put bools in there, or should they use network bool?
I think properties inside iNetwork structs have to be marked as networked, because if you don't mark, it's not the whole struct that's going to be networked. It just tags that struct may be networked. But I think I'm not the expert on that particular struct data structure, but as far as I know, you have to mark as networked the data inside an iNetwork struct that you want to, because you may want to have data that you do not want to be networked anyway for local computation of something, and you can still do it. Basically, you create your iNetwork struct, so it can be a networked property itself, but not all of it needs to be part of the data that's sent. So you also have to mark those. What differentiates a type like network bool from a regular type? It's all internal from your. I mean, when you explicitly use network bool, well, in the end, it becomes just a property, but you are actually operating directly in our type. I think it's much more convenient from your perspective to use the regular C# type, because we store internally the network bool, but you don't have to know about that. That's part of the data buffers that are done with the manual memory allocation and handled for you over the network. From your perspective, you have a get set of a regular C# boolean or a regular C# string. That's much more convenient because you can reuse existing code. For example, you would just work. You don't have to think about our type. So I would recommend you to use the regular C# type.
So do we follow the multiplayer game jam work in
I
progress
do.
channel? I also do.
Yeah, and there are a couple of other of us who do as well. Um, I'm curious about a lot of stuff. I mean, I've seen some interesting stuff from people doing like I remember one guy posting a test with 4 different clients and a character moving around. I'm curious to see what they're gonna do with that. I've seen people posting a character running with plenty of physics objects moving around. I've seen some people posting that thing that draws on the floor, but these are the only ones I've seen with multiple clients popping up. So I've seen actually, oh, this is actually something multiplayer. I've seen some interesting concepts, some visual concepts and ideas, but I have to see those online. We're halfway through the jam, and multiplayer when you do something multiplayer, in my honest opinion, you have to start day one with multiplayer, and not, of course, not for the artists and concept artists and game designers necessarily, but for you to have a game in the end, you have to code it and also draw it. But what I'm mostly curious to see what people are going to come up with. It's exciting to see things being tested already, but I'm curious to see I mean, one comment I like that people put a lot of effort even in menus. That's interesting. It resonates with me because it shows that people have a lot of care for what they're building for the gem.
Yeah, there were a few really interesting entries in that channel. Like there was the one where players could draw on the floor, and at first I thought that has to be quantum, right? Because synchronizing all the game state of like where is the color, that's pretty hard. But I think they're actually using Fusion for that.
Yeah, I mean, I'm curious to see what people do with either, right? So this question about limit on number of attribute properties in a scene of we don't have a limit. It's honestly it's some misconception people have in the way Fusion work is that it doesn't really matter how many network objects you have. It doesn't really matter how many network properties you have. It's all about the data that changes. The only things that are transferred over the network are the data that changes. And if you're running client server mode, the data that changes that matters to that client. So if you use area of interest or other forms of interest management, even if certain data changes, it doesn't have to get to that client. So is there a hard limit? It's chosen by you based on the amount of memory you want to have on a server or on the clients in general. And what is the reasonable limit depends on the game, depends on the platform, depends on what you're trying to do. So the answer, we don't have any hard limit. You can have 16,000 objects. Actually, the BR200 have about 15,000 objects, I think, in total. But it really depends on what changes and how many of them are updated or something like that. And the granularity of the properties. If there is a general rule, I would say that it's better to have some network objects with a lot of properties, as long as if you don't change them all the time, it doesn't mean that they're sent all the time. But having many network objects means that the header for each individual object sometimes have to be sent. So it's a trade-off that I tend to recommend having slightly beefier network objects than having a lot of very small network objects. That's a general recommendation, but it's again case by case. How do you feel about the gem, Luke or Daniel?
Luke, you want to take this one? I feel it's going well and as somehow like we expected, and it's nice to see so many new people trying the engines and learning, and it's nice for us as well to learn to find maybe weak spots that we could address better in the docs, explain in samples. So it's um, it's a good experience for us as well, developers.
Yeah, what I like about it is really how many new people it brings into multiplayer, right? I've seen so many people here come in, and multiplayer was always that very scary thing, which was hard to do, right? And then now with the ability to use both quantum and fusion, which makes multiplayer quite easy, people can come up with these amazing multiplayer prototypes in just a few weeks of work. So that's something that I just find really nice to see. Are there other multiplayer game jams? I do think we are probably not the first, but we are the first global
It's not
game
the
jam,
first. Yeah,
multiplayer
it's
game
not the
jam.
first because I know at least one. I organized a private quantum gem once. In Brazil when I was visiting family there with a few former students of mine. I've been a professor before, and And it was a great gem, actually. In the end, we ended up with something that turned to be a sample later on that we acquired from one of the teams. And that's where we found Daniel.
Yeah, that's
So
how I
Daniel,
started with Quantum. It was in a game jam.
he was part of a team using Quantum for a game jam, and then he was in university still and everything. And some time later, an opportunity showed up, and that's how he joined the team. He was part of a jam, and now
Exactly.
he's so there is an interesting story. Some people ask. I've seen. I mean, we don't have any new question. Oh, we do have. Although I'm gonna tell my story at the end. Okay, it's the Blizzard story, Daniel.
Oh,
But
okay.
let's see. Let's take the question first. Oh no, the question was this one. Yeah, no, I'm confused. So let me
Yeah,
tell the
go
story
ahead with
about
your
Blizzard.
story. Yeah.
So I've seen these slides before. My PhD. It's the first time I'm telling this story live on a stream or so. I tell them to students and other people sometimes. So my PhD advisor, he was on an event that had some guys from the AAA game industry or whatever a long time ago, and there was this guy from Blizzard who gave this talk, and he had some very interesting slides, and it was a summary was this. So he was talking to a lot of professors, and he was saying, um, so what do we want? So he say, we as Blizzard, we want to find great employees, and I'm pretty sure your students want to find great jobs at good companies, and I'm pretty sure you as professors want your students to find great jobs. And then he says, all beautiful, right? So where do things go wrong? And then he starts. It's the guy from Blizzard who says this. So it is the fact that normally programming, at least I'm talking about programming, okay? So in programming you need hard stuff. You need to know math, you need to know calculus, algebra, you need to know at least to work uh, on game engine or on gameplay systems that are more complex. That's what a company like Blizzard, or for example like us, normally ask you to have a minimum understanding of a good understanding of math. You also need communication, you also need a lot of, you need to know principles of C and C++. Even if you're going to program in C sharp like we do, we program like in C sharp, but a lot more like C than actually C sharp, because we use pointers all the time, especially internally. But the point that I wanted to bring is that it's about expectations. You guys are doing a game jam and you guys are starting, right? Many of you are starting. Some are experienced already. But um, one important thing is about expectations. And you never start something as the network guy or the physics guy or the shader guy. You are just the new guy whenever you get a new job or something like that. And I wanted to I remember this topic because Daniel came from a game jam. He was at the university at the time. Then he was the new guy at some point, and now he is the physics guy, right? So he made that journey. So maybe he should comment a bit about that. But let's see the question we have. Yeah, it was. This particular jam, I think it was 4 or 5 entries, right, Daniel? But all teams finished. All teams ended up with
Yeah,
a multiplayer game made in Quantum. It
it
was
was a
very interesting.
it's a 2 week long jam. It's very nice one, and it was Quantum V1 at the time.
It was V1. Yeah.
And yeah, it is indeed a long road, and I guess we just try to fill the places that are needed and that we feel comfortable working with. So I always liked math and physics stuff, and it just felt right. And things started to come up, problems that needed solving. So that's how things start to build. And 3 years later, here I am. So it's nice to remember these key times.
Yeah, sorry for the off topic, guys, but
Yeah,
I just remember that thing because you guys asked about the jam and how if another multiplayer jam happened. I remember that one. And feel free to ask. We're waiting for the next question here. It can be a technical question about something Photon. Can be a question on other topics, programming topics that are related to multiplayer. We're here to answer. Could be things also not necessarily about our products.
And there was
Um,
also a second part to the question,
mm,
which is like what kind of
oh yeah,
scale of projects are typically expected in a game jam? And here, my core piece of advice would really be KISS. So keep it simple, stupid. Don't take too much, especially if this is the first time you're creating a jam game. Keep it very, very simple, but instead create something polished that is well thought out.
yeah. Don't overcomplicate. Focus on a core mechanic that's fun. I mean, but keep it simple mean applies to in so many different levels, right? So but when it comes to multiplayer, don't try to do something overly complicated in multiplayer aspects. It can be something that's very, so if you do, sometimes just throwing an object with physics is complicated in multiplayer, not if you use quantum. So if you use the right tool, if the gameplay is simple, maybe it is simple to do in multiplayer if you use the right tool, but focus on a core mechanic, make that feel great. It's about programming. Then, if you think about it's same stuff that people say about character design, just try to find the base direction for the character design, stick to that. Do not try to make dozen characters on the game gen. Do two maybe a variation of the character and polish that, make it very coherent, work a little bit on the animation if you have time for it. Don't overdo rendering, but do something that looks nice and pleasant. So apply the concept of not doing too much in complexity, but doing a lot of effort to make that thing you chose to do be very polished.
And the
That's
polishing should always come after the base blocks, right? So there needs to be something to be polished for the polishing to happen.
to
So
happen. Yeah.
yeah, work on the core mechanics first. Have the gameplay with beginning and ending with some objectives, with a menu, with connection, and then start if you want to take a look at polishing, make some polishing on the menu or on the UI, on the animations,
Or
then you start working on that.
yeah, if you need a care, I mean, this is for the. It's important for the person doing the programming to jump into multiplayer day one. Do the base gameplay mechanics using boxes. Then the guy doing the character is going to start doing a character, and then he polishes over that character. But each person does its own job, right? So I mean, if you're working alone, like for example, I do sometimes, that's exactly what I also do. No artists available, which is, it tells something maybe about the way you are working. Um, when I work alone, I do exactly the same to keep motivated. I jump from different things. I just spend a couple of days modeling 3D stuff or working on shaders, and then I go back to gameplay, whatever. To it's that's a very very good piece of advice here. Just don't stop working. If you're getting too bored, stuck into something, change subject a bit, and but keep doing it. The point is not, it's avoid overdoing in terms of quantity of content that sometimes it overwhelming, but in terms of quantity of effort, the more you put into it, it's always the best. You are learning, you are polishing something, you are getting something new done. Yeah, fine. But yeah, that's great piece of advice here.
And regarding programming, I feel like one of the main issues that some people might find is over engineering some features, right? So sometimes you want to work on a system that will be scalable and will be easy to adjust and welcome new features, but sometimes you just need to make it work for the game design you came up with for the gem. It doesn't need to be something of another world. So I feel like this is a personal struggle I have with, which is sometimes attempting to make something very complex and flexible. And it's not necessary for a gem. It's okay to have some technical depth if you can make the feature work as intended for the game jam. Some people say that when they want to expand a game, they work for a game jam, they toss the code on the trash. That you cannot reuse any of it because it's okay. You build it for the jam, and it does not need to be perfect.
Yeah. Just to pick up on what no artist available is saying here, yeah, I agreed as well. In teams, communication becomes a big block, and it is important as well because you need coherence and everything. And normally in teams, you're doing a lot more content, but professionally. And on a jam, yeah, sometimes it's tempting to go alone. It's a valid way to do a jam, especially if you want to experiment something that's very personal to you. I honestly like to work. I work better in duels. So whenever I find one partner that does, if I can find an artist that I like stuff, I've done this and it was great. A couple of times I found with two different people. I've worked in duels with an artist and it was great. Both times we finished an interesting game. And I mean, because I like to work on shaders a bit sometimes, I would one day like to do something like that with somebody else taking their programming role, not me. But I think I work well in duels as well for gems, and but yeah, in general, work teams is also very important. But for gem, it's a valid approach. Do you guys want to share? I mean, what are your favorite ways to work on gems, Luke and Daniel?
Yeah, I've never really jammed alone. Although I think it would be a nice experience, so I like to be part of a team. It helps me stay motivated during the jam, like having people coming up with ideas and pushing for them to become reality. So I like this group environment. It works well for me.
For me, the one thing I always need to keep reminding myself while working on a jam game is that as you go further into the jam, the scope of what you're working on should really get smaller and more clear. And I often
Not
have
bigger,
the
yeah.
opposite, where I start with an idea, then we polish it up, and once we reach that point, we can kind of see, yeah, but there is another way to do this, which also would be pretty nice, right? So you get these ideas as we go further, and sometimes it's just really nice to stick to the plan. So at the beginning, take some time and brainstorm many ideas, but then as you go further, just go towards a direction and stick with it, unless you really have a good reason to change. Yeah.
I like the question from Ludo here. So, any advice on teamwork organization? What tools do you use, like Monday, Trello, or just GitHub? I'll tell a few things. So, um, 2022, getting something with more than one people. I mean, I would say GitHub or any other form of source control is mandatory. You do not send zip files around anymore. It's just a waste of time, and time is precious on a gem. So GitHub or equivalents, yes. But then something to register ideas is always nice. I mean, we use Trello internally in our teams. And other tools as well, but Trello is one of the tools we use internally. But it can be even something lighter than Trello. It can be even Google Doc, a Google Drive documents. It's whatever you guys are more comfortable with that you guys can write down stuff. Remember, Kamak would code Quake and Doom just writing a TXT to do file that he ended up becoming almost like a blog thing, but that's how he kept things going and communicating with both internally. And I mean, he talks a lot about that in many interviews. But yeah, it's whatever your team is most familiar with. But I think at least source control and one way to register the ideas and what is being done, what needs to be done to keep track. It doesn't have to be overly complicated, but whatever. At least these two. You guys here have any other suggestion on
I was
fundamental
going to
tools?
say exactly that. Just go with whatever you are more familiar and more comfortable with. Not only you, but your team. So if you have three people that are used to work with Trello, then go for Trello. create a few lists, drop some cards with ideas, turn them into tasks, and so on and so forth. So yeah, familiarity helps a lot, and I agree with Eric. Source um,
Control.
versioning source control is important, and especially if you are working with Unity, I guess. I One thing I like is to avoid scene merges. There are tools to help with that, but if you have ever had to do a complex scene merge, you know how troublesome it can be. So I would advise like working on, if you're working on prefabs, working on code, and just making it available so that someone can just put it together on a scene instead of modifying the scene multiple times for every little change you do.
That's a good point, a very good point, Daniel. I think I can complement that with a few other topics. Now let's go back to multiplayer here, and so because you have source control, piece of advice here: get a nice git ignore that just pushes the stuff that you need to be pushed. But one piece of advice here in the team, if you have programmers working together with designers who do not program and with graphic designers or technical artists who are not going to program the gameplay, it's very important to perhaps even have branches that the developer controls. Here is the design branch that he always pushes the DLLs. The code is ready, so he sends the code as it should be, and it doesn't so the designer do not expect to compile things, especially important when using Quantum, that you have an external structure project for the gameplay. So send the DLLs up to the repo for the branch where designers are going to work. But do not modify the scenes. You let the designers modify the scenes. So try to keep that organized, and you're going to have a lot less issues with merges and rebases and so on. So it's something simple, but it's important to agree on a structure on how to do that.
I'd like to add one thing here. There are a lot of tools which help you organize or manage your team, right? Like Trello, Asana, Jira. The best teams I've seen when it comes to working together, they don't work well together because they use a certain tool, right? Because the organization tool is just a tool to help your team communicate. What you should focus on is communication in the team. So understand, how do your people want to work? What are their individual needs? How can you help them, right? So that's really important to keep that going. You cannot solve that by simply putting tasks onto a board, right? There needs to be an understanding of what people want to do.
Get a Discord to communicate with each other is something that nobody's talking about, but is obviously necessary. Something like that you have a chat that you talk to people, and you can do voice or a call if you need to, if that makes you more efficient. It's about getting people that you work well with, and then using the tools that make sense. Totally agreed. Do we have any more questions? Keep the questions coming, and then we'll keep talking.
We have 5 more minutes. So, any last questions?
I do have one. Are you working on any game, Luke?
Right now,
For the gem?
I wanted to, but I'm afraid I might not be able to finish it. And that is because I didn't follow my own advice here. So I wanted to play around with VR just because I think it's a platform with a lot of potential, but it's also really hard to create something that feels well. And that's really what I figured out doing that. It takes a lot of time to polish a VR game, and I just don't have that time during the jam, which is a bit unfortunate, but it was a good learning experience.
I think you are not doing a game, right, Daniel?
I'm working with a few of the guys internally on an idea one
Oh,
another friend had. Yeah, so we're
oh,
working on
nice,
a
nice. I
game.
didn't know you guys are
Although,
working on a team. That's
yeah, although
nice.
we cannot upload it for
No, not for the competition, but you
participate.
can
Yeah, not for
share.
the
But you can
competition,
share
but yeah, we are
the with everybody
doing
else. Yeah.
our own game during the gen. I'm actually behind the schedule, so I need to work on this weekend to keep up with what we have in mind.
Mm. So my game actually, Luke. I ended up narrowing down the gameplay, and I have something that I think already is already fitting. I have the gameplay ready. I haven't worked on it over the past 5 days actually, but I have something that's even ready to play test. And it's basically about polishing now and adding more UI, more feedback. But yeah, I have something. Let's see. I even did a round of playtest with some of the guys, and yeah, just to so the three of us would talk about it. We have a final question here that I think is a nice one. What is the most ingenious multiplayer game app you've ever played?
Luke, do you want to start?
I think I'll need more time for that. That's a
Yes, me
very
too.
tricky
I'm
question.
actually more of a single player gamer,
Hmm.
uh,
Me too.
but yeah,
How can that be? We're all
yes,
working on
exactly.
multiplayer, and we
We should
all
all be
played
ashamed.
single player games mostly. Ingenious is a very it's the tricky part because I've played a lot of
Yeah,
multiplayer games that I enjoyed. I enjoyed a lot of original Dota. I enjoyed a lot of real-time strategy games. I love StarCraft 1 and 2. I played some League of Legends, although very poorly. Um, I've played some shooters, but I suck at shooters. But I enjoyed playing some of them. But uh, but Ingenious, I mean, I really like the physics on Stumble guys, obviously, but we are biased. And Ingenious is the tricky part of the question. I don't have an answer right now, but let's say I will answer that on the Global Game Jam Discord, on the general
yeah.
channel.
I'd like
I'll think about it. I'll
to
answer
hear
it from home.
recommendations. I'd like
Yeah,
to hear
maybe
recommendations
recommendations of
from whoever is
ingenious
watching
net
us. Yeah,
multiplayer games.
if you have one in mind, please send it our way so we can test it and see if we agree on the ingenious part.
I feel like
I've
I've played a lot of multiplayer games. And like one thing that really mattered wasn't really that much the game, but the people and the community I played with. So that's one thing. Like when I played League of Legends, it was more about the people I played that with together
hmm
as a team and less about the game, which was frustrating sometimes, to put it easily. But one game came to mind for me, which is
I have one now that I
Journey.
remember. Yeah.
Journey is a super interesting multiplayer game because it's basically a single player game, but you're with other people's in the same map or journey, and you can see them and you can send very simple sound messages to them. So it's like just a single tune. And what it gives you is that experience that you're not alone. So it's a very artistic, scenic game about wandering through a wide world, and you really get that feeling that you're together with someone, even though you're not. So that for me was very ingenious, just because it's different.
You asked about ingenious and in multiplayer. Um, there is a game I haven't played, but I think is one of the most ingenious games I've ever seen, which is Keep Talking and Nobody Explodes. Have you guys seen that one? It's a game where someone is on a VR headset, the other person is on using has paper instructions. It could be played also on a computer with the instructions and so on. But you have voice communication, but the person with the instructions have instructions on how to defuse a bomb, and the person on the VR headset actually has the controls and is seeing the bomb and has to defuse the bomb. And there are very different ways to that the activities that the person with the instruction has to explain the other, and the person on VR has to execute them correctly, otherwise they die, they explode. So keep talking and nobody explodes. It's super ingenious, and I think that whole asymmetric idea can be expanded so much in different directions that I think, well, that's a nice one.
Yeah, I remember now one. I had to search it here for the name because I do not have it installed anymore. But it was called Arena Battle Champions. It's from Strictly Games. Was made with Quantum, I believe. And I started playing it as part of our play testing with customers, um, and then I continued to play for a long time after that because I just enjoyed the game a lot. And there's one characteristic I liked the most was that um, when you were close to your allies, if an enemy came close, you would just attack randomly whoever is at your reach distance. So staying close to each other makes sure that the damage is spread between everyone, so nobody
Mm,
dies. So it was very nice to just people would walk together and cooperate with each other without any need for communication. It was just natural, and I felt it was really nicely implemented. So Arena Battle Champions, I liked a lot.
cool. Luke, I think it's time for us to wrap it up.
Yep, don't think we have any more questions. So thank you everyone for all the great questions. We had a great time here answering
Yeah,
them
it's
for
fun.
us. Thank you as well, both Daniel and Eric, for being here on the stream.
Thanks, guys. Thanks for having me.
Thanks for having me, Luke, and see you guys next time. Bye bye.
See
Yes,
you.
see you guys
Bye.
next time. We have
Have
another
fun.
QA stream next week in case you have more questions to ask. Bye.